Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Stacy Varghese, and I'm the Director of Leadership Annual Giving and Engagement at St. John's University. Today, we have Mark Armiento, who will conclude our wellness series with a talk on the importance of life balance and mental health. Some housekeeping rules before we begin. If you have a question, please submit it on the bottom right in the chat section to panelists and host, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. In addition, a recording of today's session will be uploaded on the St. John's University Alumni Professional Development page. Now, I'm excited to introduce our speaker. For 40 years, Mark has been providing clinical care, consultation, and training services for individuals and professionals in the areas of personal development, sports performance, private and public city organizations, and general health and wellness. He has delivered organizational management consulting and training services to various city governments in the Northeast and has been a sports psychology consultant for St. John's University since 1998 in the athletics department. Mark is the founder of Life Balance Advantage, LLC, and has a private practice for individual, couple, and family counseling in Westchester, New York. Welcome, Mark. I will hand the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it. Welcome all. I'm so happy to be here. I will spend some time hopefully answering your questions at the end, and I'll give you a quick overview of how I see the, I think, 40-something minutes going. Easiest way to remember me, as Stacy just mentioned, Armiento. Just think of Army and your big toe. I put a couple of images below my website there so that you can remember that's not how I spell it, but that's how I pronounce it. I will definitely give you a little bit of background on just a little bit about the important areas of my experience and what values I have, because I'll weave that through the presentation as well. It's going to be on a general review of life balance and how it impacts mental health, and in particularly in the last couple of years, as I'll talk about, especially with families and young students, it's been quite challenging to say the least. On the last slide at the end of the presentation also, you'll have the information of how to access me via the email and or my website. So I think what's most important is to give you just a quick overview of the value-based experiences that I try to weave into this presentation. Being a licensed family therapist and mental health worker in the last 45 years, I still see families almost every day, and it's been extremely challenging, to say the least, during the pandemic in terms of what's been happening with families. Mental health counselor as well as addiction counselor and trainer, which I'll talk about. So the values of not only recovery, but the values of wellness are important to me. The last 25 years was, as well as that, doing some work designing rehabs. So addiction and recovery, long-term recovery programs in the earlier days were a little over a year and a half where people stayed with me. 55, adolescents, teenagers. And again, a lot of people don't want to deal with this particular challenging moment in terms of people's connection to chemicals, but if they're adolescents, they especially don't want to connect. So it's a value base for me, working with young kids who are going through those kinds of struggles. Also ran training institutes in Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island to train individual counselors to be substance abuse counselors. A little over 4,000 or 5,000, I believe, through the state of New York has been certified in those 3 training locations through an outreach project. The last 20-something years, team building, both for families with Outward Bound courses, but also team building for not just athletic teams, but for corporations. So Fort Lauderdale, I think it was somewhere around 2,600 employees, Homestead, Florida, Oakland Park, White Plains. Corporate teams and nonprofits try to work together and to become more effective and efficient and bond together. And that's a piece of the work that I do as well. The sports psychology has been the last 20-something years. St. John's, my favorite place in the world. I have been connected there since the late 90s and do work out of Coneseca 136 and love working with young people there. Also, other institutions, Niagara, Iona, again, the worst thing in the world, as some of you know, is when you have two sons or two daughters playing on the same team. And oftentimes having athletes that are in different schools playing each other is a challenge for me. I kind of have to stay in the moment. And I love working with individuals who can work through the process of not just getting their education, but their sport at the same time. In the last probably 12 years, designing my own Life Balance Advantage LLC. I have podcasts, which I'll talk about on Spotify or iTunes, audio and written book, Sleepwalking on a Tightrope. And so what I've been trying to do in the last probably decade, a little bit more, is to destigmatize people's developmental work on themselves without the shame and the shame rather and the stigma that's around. So personal development is important to me. Life balance is important to me, and that's trying to get people to associate to the importance of being able to notice what's going on in their lives and be able to take healthy steps to move through that. Stress is something I just want to spend a couple of moments on. I think if I haven't already done that, I want to go back once. There it is. Some of you are well informed with the area of stress, but there might be others not. I want to keep it general in terms of not just how it impacts the body, but also how it can impact work locations. Doing a lot of work with corporations, people do get what they call burnt out or slowed down or fatigued in the process. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how people get to those places and how they can move through that. There are lots of people who cope well and just equally amount those who don't cope well in terms of the ways in which they choose how to deal with their stress. Sleep is extremely important. I will definitely spend a few slides on that. And when I get to the life balance toward the end, we're looking at just preserving the most important resource that you have, and that's your energy. And it's not just your physical energy, it's also your perspective of your emotional centeredness, your ability to mentally focus, your ability to connect in healthy relationships and to be aligned spiritually. So I'll spend some time on that as well. And then hopefully we'll have a question or two, and you'll always be able to ask questions to me post this presentation as well. So first, as you can see in that little icon there that usually moves, but it's not moving now, is it's important to be able to assess when you're overloaded. Some people are aware when they're under stress, but believe it or not, there are a lot of people who are not even connected consciously to when they're overloaded. So there's a quick burnout tool that has been developed. I don't know exactly how it works. It's two identical dolphins. You're going to see them coming out of the water. If a person sees minor distinctions between the two dolphins, it could mean that they're under a little bit of stress. If there are major differences between the two dolphins, when I flip it, it could mean that you need a vacation, okay? So here it goes. We're going to go quickly. All right. I'll do that again. And I'm smiling now because no matter when I do this in lecture, there's always these people who stare at me and they will never say, oh my God, am I the only one that saw the cow? Yes, there's a cow. This is my kind of light way of letting people know that stress is normal. We experience it as human beings day in and day out. So what I want you to do is accept the fact that if you look at the data, and again, this slide, I'm going to tell you its date soon, says it all. You're not the only one that is going through that. A third of Americans are living in extreme stress. Over 75% talk about issues at work and money concerns as being their central focus of the stress that they're under. And almost a half feel that their stress has increased in the last 5 years. Now, that data from the American Psych Association is dated. Believe it or not, it's over 10 years old and it's well before the pandemic. And I purposely put that out because these numbers are probably exceedingly higher than what's right here. And I can, as I said, see this in the work that I do day in and day out. A quick overview for those people who may not be in touch with it. I think it's important to understand that it's not just physical stress that you may be under, but it could be not just a biological reaction, but a mental reaction, as well as emotional. And it could be to anything that excites you or irritates you or makes you moody, or as a lot of people say, it's a common process. And I think oftentimes people are not aware enough of when they're in these moments, and definitely are not clear about what to do to move through them. There is an upside. I tell athletes this all the time. It stimulates creativity and productivity. And I can tell you stories of athletes that actually stimulate stress responses as a way to increase focus before they perform. When it's negative, it's often because things are stressful and excessive, and oftentimes they don't know how to manage those moments. The assessment tool that I usually use, I don't have time now, is around the amount of change that's happened in your life in the last 2 years. Change produces stress, both positive and negative, whether that's, I know, winning lotteries or moving homes or getting divorced or changing schools or physical health. Any kind of change that's occurred in your life oftentimes is directly related in the year or two ahead with physical illness. And so just be aware of the moments that, and there's been a lot of change, not just in the world, but in people's lives recently. And change sometimes is a stress-producing moment that people need to be mindful of. Can stress be contagious? Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about this when I talk about relationships, and I talk about people's connection to folks who might be under a lot of pressure and how that impacts themselves. A lot of you have heard the physiology piece about the fight or flight response. But there are people sometimes that use the stress as a way of making decisions and even challenging decisions in their life. And so they'll build up the stress as a way to take action. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wanted to give you the physiology piece of what happens when there's trauma responses. I work with a lot of people, young and old, who have been through significant trauma in their lives. And oftentimes when that is triggered, and it can be triggered in a sport, it not only motivates us to move through the biology that's occurring in our body by fighting or flighting, but oftentimes freezing or flocking. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. When I talk about freezing or flocking, I'm talking about stopping or connecting to certain safe people in their lives in small kind of gatherings. But in this physiological response, there's chemicals and there's hormones that are obviously triggering people. And oftentimes people don't know there's that biology going on, especially young folks. It impacts them in their ability just to eat, digest. Oftentimes you'll see major shifts in people's weight loss or weight gain. They're in a crisis mode. They're definitely physiologically aroused, and their creativity sometimes is negatively impacted. I see this a lot with students. I'm sure you have too, around midterms or finals, where all of a sudden they can't read the notes they need to read, or feel that they're not comprehending because they're under this kind of heightened alertness. Problem solvings could be challenging. They get impatient, irritable, isolated, and this isolation and irritability piece has been huge in the pandemic stage. Being around and listening to people day in and day out, one of the emotions that I don't hear as frequently as I have in the last 2 years is people feeling lonely. And I think the isolation has really challenged us to fully accept, as some of us have known, that we're social beings. And that social connection needs to be not just virtual, it needs to be face to face. And so when athletes are isolated, and in the last couple of years, seeing people in quarantine in hotel rooms alone for multiple weeks with meals kind of left at their doorstep, not being able to connect with family members who are living around the world has been enormously challenging and has impacted anxiety and panic and other things that have scared a lot of people who have never gone through those experiences except during the pandemic. Can your blood pressure go up? Absolutely. I always love that data where your blood pressure is risen just by the fact that you know it's going to be measured by a doctor. So this physiology piece impacts us by not only feeling physically depleted and exhausted, but at times mentally from feeling sad and down. As I said before, the analogy that I think is important is understanding that the body is trying really to get itself to move through the moment that might be stressful. Oftentimes I speak about, I won't today, but anxiety does not have to be pathological. Sometimes anxiety is not a problem. It's the ability that the body is using to try to prepare and get ready. So I think getting folks to understand it's not always something that they should be worried about when their body is aroused. But when people are stimulated, especially around maybe past trauma or other experience that have occurred in their life, their parts of their brain functioning is not connected. And so oftentimes when that fight or flight biological function is occurring, it's hard to think through that process in a balanced way. And oftentimes when I speak and lecture to coaches, I try to give them that perspective so that they can better understand and recognize when athletes are in stressful moments. And it's not that they're ignoring their coaches. Oftentimes they're just over-focused on what's happening biologically. And the analogy I give is that, if you are on a freeway and you had to cross the freeway or throughway, it would increase your arousal system. If I asked you while you're running across the freeway, I want you to do a math problem, you wouldn't be able to do it. So to be able to use the cognitive part of your thinking when you're aroused with the fight or flight is extremely challenging, maybe not even possible. So that's the analogy I try to give folks to understand that there's a process to de-escalate from the arousal, give themselves the kind of time and compassion that they need to settle down and move through it. Oftentimes, you're going to see that people who are under stress feel like they have no energy. They're not able to focus in their work relationship. Their relationships suffer at home and with family. And that's happened dramatically with families in the last couple of years. And then people feel sad and at times depressed. The sleep piece is extremely important. Roxanne Pritchard, who spoke, I think, at St. John's, but also I've seen her at Big East conferences, puts out data that is striking to me. And when you look at the REM sleep, normally around 2 hours each night, oftentimes people don't understand that being deprived from that REM sleep will impact not only their mind and body, but profound dimensions of themselves. And especially young folks don't understand at times that, number one, certain chemicals, including alcohol, impact REM, but that if they are sleep deprived, and her research is really talking about, as people think it's kind of crazy when I say 9 to 10 is optimal, that the average student athlete or student in college is only getting 6.25. And if you're 21 hours sleep deprived, it's like being intoxicated. And her data also talks about 24 hours without sleep deprivation is like a zero point 0.1 intoxication level. And I love her analogy. It's almost like, how can you do a term paper when you've had 3 shots of alcohol? Not literally, but figuratively. And so I try to make sure that students understand the importance of sleep, because sleep deprivation will increase blood sugar and anxiety and heart rate. And it's the second question I will always ask individuals who come to see me is, the first is, how do you think I might be able to help? And the second is, how many hours of sleep that you're getting? Because I'm sure some of you have always noticed that after a good night's sleep or two, a lot of things seem to shift or change in a positive fashion. If you look at the slide here, you'll begin to see that if I had to cluster what challenges students have in terms of impacting their sleep, it's usually around three areas: stress, technology in the bedroom, and poor time management. Not to say that there's not others, as you'll see there, but those are the three that I think it's important to focus on. When you look at sleep issues, and I tell folks that I work with clearly what the data is, that if they're in bad sleep patterns, they're 9 times more likely to be depressed and 17 times more likely to be anxious. And in my business, oftentimes it's very clear that bad sleep patterns are definitely indicated in depression 50% of the time, mania 75%, and suicide attempts almost 9 out of 10 times. So sleep is important. And in this day and age, apps are made to keep you on them, as you well know, and research has proven that it negatively impacts mental health and sleep. And for some people, I think it's hard to move through this information without having, a feeling or two about the process, because we're all use technology, and there is a huge upside to technology. But for today, I just want to recognize what I see oftentimes, and I'm sure some of you do too, with people's kind of overconnection to technology. It may be the new ADD, and I think you've seen, especially if you have young kids around you, that they are overstimulated in the evenings by not just their phones, but other kinds of lights and TVs and notifications that keep their arousal in places where they'll never get REM sleep. So I put together just a series of slides for you, and a person who I have a lot of respect for, Albert, predicted this day, and I'll give you his slide toward the end. But what he predicted, you're going to see, is it's not uncommon that people, when they're eating dinner, are eating, but there's no social contact between them. You can see that not just in eating locations, at beaches, at sporting events, at museums, and the one that concerns me probably the most and is the most consequential is while driving. And as Albert said, I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots. And so the long and short of this is, I think when I talk about the importance of sleep, I have to mention the challenge at times with technology and being able to put these systems down. There are apps to induce sleep. There are ways in which to slow down before people have their kind of scheduled bedtime. But oftentimes it's more common that people are leaving technology on and then feeling tired, even though they fell asleep after they were fatigued at 2 in the morning. So that's my essence of why I spend time on the sleep issue, because at times technology is negatively impacting. I work with a lot of young people who are in grammar school and especially high school, and people's focus on social media is profound these days. And it not only is impacting stress levels, it's definitely impacting people's levels of depression, concern, body image, and, as I said earlier, loneliness. When it gets to a work setting, and a lot of you are in this place where you're working with people who are going through challenging times, I think the term compassion fatigue is important, and I'll define that, as well as a term that's been used in the past around burnout and what happens when employees are just stressed. Compassion fatigue has to do with kind of the negative reactions that occur when you're working with either trauma survivors or people who are under a lot of stress. And you'll see this a lot with folks who are in hospital settings. That's why I have a lot of respect for nurses and doctors who have been going through what they're going through in the last couple of years, as well as military folks and people who are putting out fires and police officers. So oftentimes, I think that compassion fatigue is something that is focused on if you have people who are doing this kind of work. If you're doing other kinds of work, it's a term that we use around work is the burnout term. And the way in which I try to describe that to employees is that whenever there's chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors in a job between employees or bosses or outcomes, oftentimes employees talk about feeling tired or exhausted. The other two experiences they'll have when they're talking about burnout is depersonalization, where they feel a little detached or disengaged at work with individuals that they're working with. But they're also talk about not feeling that they're competent in what they're really gifted in doing. And so even though they're doing something that they've been doing for years and are very competent in doing, they now start to second guess their ability to do that very thing. Who's most susceptible to burnout in a corporate field or in a work setting are two attributes of the person who is all in and they invest highly in what they're doing, and they're invested in a stressful situation or occupation. And that level of stress could be in both corporate and non-corporate settings. And I've mentioned before that change, if it occurs, and there's been an enormous amount of change in work locations through the pandemic and isolations as well. And so that change definitely has increased stress. There are three core problems that I think are impacted, as I would have to summarize it when I talk to people in my settings. And those three core problems is, almost 3/4 of the folks don't even have healthy stress reduction techniques, never learn them. Most don't have any idea of how their mind is powerfully connected to their body, and they don't understand that self-medication, and I'll mention 10 of them, are unhealthy ways of dealing with stress. What I'll always say, and you'll see me write about this or in the audio book, in the podcast, is that adversity in your life is a wake-up call. And adversity is a blessing in disguise. I think when you're in it, you don't really connect it. But when you get past it, you look back and realize that the adversity helped us move and helped us develop in different ways. And I do believe that we can learn from even the last couple of years during the pandemic as well. So, you know about placebo, and that's when someone is given a substance that is like sugar, but told it's medication and it works. What a lot of people never heard is the term nocebo, and that's the opposite, that you can be given that same sugar and say that it's going to create negative effects, and it does. But for me, what's important is that you understand the brain works both ways, and that negative thoughts from yourself or other people can negatively impact you or hurt you. So when I talk about self-medication, there's lots of ways to do that, but I think the 10 top are drugs, alcohol, and food. Sex and unhealthy relationships, definitely gambling, and that has shifted dramatically with apps now where people are gambling without leaving their own homes. Social media, obsessive technology, which I mentioned. People can definitely overfocus and self-medicate by negative thinking, self-doubt, choosing to not act, like procrastinate, and resentment. So I mention those because I think people are waking up to realizing there are healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with their lives. And for me, as I said, in the last 12 years, working and developing a corporation that deals with life balance is the way in which I've chose to work with. Unfortunately, we can't really take any action until Waldo is ready. I know I'm dating myself here, but finding Waldo is finding yourself. Believe it or not, a student made that little picture for me, and I am in it, but you'll never find me. And the question is, can you find yourself? And that's the only Waldo that you need to focus on is, where are you in terms of your physical health, emotional well-being, your thinking, your relationships, and your connection to your spiritual and or religious focus in life. When I talk to people about their energy and stress, oftentimes when they're in dark moments, they feel depleted biologically. They're definitely in emotional negative space. Their focus is usually on what I call regrets of the past or future tripping, worried about the future, never in the present moment where they should be. Their interpersonal relationships, not just with family, but with teammates and significant others, are not productive. And their spiritual alignment seems to be really focused in a vain, self-absorbed way. So I'm hoping that Waldo has seen, or Waldette has seen, that at times you are not in the most balanced perspectives. And so this is what I speak about these days, that every thought and feeling and interaction that you have has an energy consequence. And so kind of talk about it like a five-finger process, but they're all interdependent, meaning that your physical energy can be impacted by your thoughts, especially if they're negative or positive. But also your thoughts can be impacted by your emotions, and your emotions can definitely be impacted by the relationships you're in. And your physical body can definitely get you self-absorbed and vainly into, again, aspects of yourself that are very limited. So the long and short here is that, the five domains, the physical, emotional, mental, interpersonal, and spiritual, are interconnected. And so it's important to always know where Waldo is. And again, these are 5 or 6 of my students who decided on graduation day to actually get dressed up and make costumes. So when I talk about Waldo, what's important is they, as well as others who have heard me speak about it, have learned that there's a value to asking oneself where one is. I think the worst thing in the world is you have an outcome or a life purpose. If I had to represent it graphically, and let's say in a mapping, I would say if your goal is to get to Florida and you live in New York, and toward the end of your life, you wake up in Kansas. Well, I wish you can click your heels 3 times and go back, but oftentimes people regret not being in Florida and being so far in a different location in their life. And what do I mean by that? People should be waking up each day and thinking about if they're moving in the right direction or not. And this is why I create just five simple questions, just to ask yourself, without any negative association to it, how balanced is Waldo or Waldette? So I'm going to give you, again, in some of the literature and other things that are on websites and books, there's 50 questions, but I only want to give you 5 today, one on each of the domains. And I want you to ask it honestly. There is no right or wrong here, and no one's going to look at it, and it's not going to be graded. But what I want you to do is just each of the 5 questions I'll read, they're combined questions, so it's sometimes you're going to see a part of it might be true and a part of it might be false. What I want you to do is just simply decide, is it more false or more true? Here are the 5 questions. Let's see if I can give you this. Physically, do you participate in regular aerobic exercise, refrain from unhealthy use of nicotine, drugs, and alcohol, follow a balanced, healthy diet, and get 8 or more hours of sleep? True or false? And again, some of that may be false, some of it may be true, but you're going to have to round it out. So that's the physical domain. The emotional domain, I notice my negative emotions. I proactively confront my fears and self-imposed limitations. I assume responsibility for my actions, living in the present moment, treating each moment as purposeful. True or false? Mental, I regularly practice stress management, meditation, accept circumstances beyond my control, support myself by practicing positive self-talk and effective time management. True or false? Relationships, I maintain balance between work or school time and my friends and family. I can listen to others, participate in healthy relationships while maintaining lasting communication, clear boundaries, while with loved ones, avoiding communicating on their behalf, and doing the talking when people find difficulty in talking for themselves. I know that's a complicated question, but you're going to have to answer more true or more false. And spiritually, I live my life with a focus beyond my self-interest, living in the here and now, this present moment, while at times experiencing unexpected flashes of insight, moments of bliss, in which I unexpectedly have a clear, deep feeling of oneness with all that exists. Again, another kind of complicated question, but ask yourself, is it more true or more false? As Henry Ford said, I believe you can either do it or not do it, and whatever you believe, it will come true. And so I think we're at a point now where you have to, when you hear yourself say, I'll do it someday, is to answer very quickly, someday is today. And so for me, if I had to isolate first steps in each of those 5 domains, I'm going to keep it extremely brief today. If you want more, we can talk more about where to get that information. But if you answered false to the physical domain, definitely it's about sleep and valuing exercise. And it has been proven to be at times much more effective than even medications. If the emotional domain was false, definitely be able to identify a feeling and communicate it. A lot of people don't know what they're feeling, can't discriminate one emotion from another, and even if they can't communicate that emotion to another human being. So that's a double skill set. And of course, I'm coupling that with relaxing and sleeping as well. The mental domain, if that was false, you need to understand that your thinking causes both health and sickness. And learning how to shift mindset and sleeping, as we talked about earlier, is important. If you're losing energy in the relationship domain, then definitely keep conversations meaningful and positive and don't accept toxic talk. And I think I can make this come alive if you have Spotify or iTunes, my podcast, either in my name or Life Balance Advantage. You definitely want to listen to the 9-minute podcast on beware of drama queens and drama kings. And don't forget drama kings, there's plenty of them. And the spiritual domain, if it's true or false, you want to find meaning and purpose in your life, and you want to believe in something larger than Waldo. So those are the quick overviews of the 5 domains. I'm going to leave you with a couple of slides because I know my time is really coming to an end. You want to take action. Oftentimes, you'll see that even people who talk about the value of not being overweight, doctors at times, almost half of the time, are overweight. So it's possible you could know something and not necessarily put action behind and beliefs behind what you think you know. And as most of us realize, oftentimes our New Year's resolutions are not met. 80% of the time, they'll probably make it on the list for repeating years. And this is why gyms are very wealthy, because people commit large dollars in the first 2 weeks of January and then very rarely go in the other months of the year. So remind yourself that the power of change, that you must take action. As I say below, you can't steer a parked car. And when would now, underscore the word now, be a good time to begin? So in closing, I'm trying to kind of watch the time. I think I'm at the 38th minute, and I want to see if there's any questions. I think the easiest way to connect with some of this material is why people may be moving around and listening to podcasts. You can find mine on either iTunes or Spotify and use my name or Life Balance Advantage. Again, paperback, but I think a lot of people are into audiobooks these days, and I spent a lot of time picking the right voice of an actor to be able to read my book. So it's Sleepwalking on a Tightrope. It really is connected to life balance, but it's really talking about the trance that people are in. It's almost like sleepwalking, where people are totally unaware until they fall off the tightrope, that they're out of balance, mind, body, and spirit. And last but not least, I want you to imagine what would happen if you could manifest your positive intentions, that you could break free of self-limiting internal thought or talk, that you can release yourself from negative emotions. And how would your life be if you could live healthier, mind, body, and spirit? Believe that you can heal yourself, and I believe this, you will discover the happiness that you so deserve and know that you're blessed. So in my saying goodbye, I will leave you with my appreciation for you being fully present in the last 40 minutes. I'm here for you. If any way you can connect with me, my email is just think about being yourself, but it's BEYOU at optimum.net. You can always get me at St. John's in Carnesecca Hall. And then a way to get my material in terms of my website is one word, lifebalanceadvantage.com. So, Stacy, I'm hopefully kept to the 40-minute timeline.
Yes, you did. Thank you. I see a few questions that came in. The first one is, my teenage daughter seems to have become more introverted with the past pandemic changes in school. With the schools now going back to normal, I notice more anxiety in her. What advice can you give me to bring her back to her old self?
Well, first and foremost, the highest form of love is listening. And I know that's easier said than done without judgment. But this is a pattern that is extremely common where people are either looking for going back or avoiding going back to school. And there's lots of parents that are really struggling with whether to force them or whether to be over secure and keep them home. And I think what's most important, at least in the relationship, is not to stigmatize the process in the sense of lecturing, but just to hold a moment for your daughter in ways that you can empathize, even though you may not agree with what they're going through, because I would never want to go through those years with what they're struggling with. And then I think you want to take it a step at a time. If you want to connect to me personally, we can talk more about the specifics.
With remote work, it is hard to shut down at the end of the day. The days are longer than they normally were. What advice can you give?
This is a really great point. I mean, I can understand this, and this is why I try to get to the gym every night. It's not necessarily to work my physical domain, but to shut down my thinking. And so I give this analogy to people all the time is if you write down your 2, 3 top concerns and put them in an index card and then go walk or do some sort of exercise for a short period of time, you come back, it's not like your concerns are gone from the index card, but you don't feel the same about them. So understanding that you need to disconnect. Years ago, 48 to be exact, I learned transcendental meditation and meditate twice a day. I don't know how people don't meditate. So being able to shut down and to kind of transcend that space. This is also why people who are need to be effective in falling asleep, there's strategies of turning down technology, shutting off all lights, and actually doing that 30 minutes before you enter sleep or lay down. And if you're wrestling in bed, don't do that more than 15 or 20 minutes because you'll associate the wrestling with the sleep posture. So you want to get out of bed, go do something on your to-do list, and come back when you get tired.
And finally, one attendee is asking if you would be willing to share your PowerPoint.
Well, I will share my information in the handout, not the PowerPoint. So if they just contact me, I'll find a way to get that to them.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I think that's it. I think you answered everybody's questions. Do you have any last thoughts to share?
Myself?
Yes.
Yes, definitely know that you're not alone and that you're blessed. And if I can help in any way, please reach out.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Mark for such an informative presentation. For Mark's complete bio, please go to www.stjohns.edu/APD series. Here you'll also find a list of upcoming webinars and past recordings. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.